Let me bring in former Foreign Minister and former leader of the Australian Liberal Party, Alexander Downer. Alexander, good to talk to you again. Just before we get on to the wash-up from the election, it must break your heart to see what's happening to Afghanistan.
Yes, it brought tears to my eyes when the Biden administration, when President Biden just suddenly withdrew from Afghanistan and left the people of Afghanistan high and dry. It was a shocking thing to do. And it had all sorts of consequences. It made America look weak. It made the West look divided and weak. And it gave encouragement to people like Xi Jinping and President Putin. I don't know this, but it's possible Putin wouldn't have gone ahead with his reckless invasion of Ukraine if it hadn't been from the withdrawal of Afghanistan. But ultimately, it's a human rights tragedy.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Now, let's go back to domestic politics here and the end of 9 years of pretty tumultuous coalition rule. What do you think the key lessons are for those who remain in the parliament and in the party to try and get themselves back on the road?
Well, my advice to them is that there are a lot of lessons from many years when the Liberal Party has sometimes won and sometimes lost elections. So there, of course, there's always talk of catastrophe when it loses an election, but there is always a chance of a comeback at the next election. So let's not be too despairing. The second thing I'd say is that a party must always give people a reason to vote for it. And for the Liberal Party, I think there was a sense of it losing its way a bit. It has to have, as Sir Robert Menzies defined it, fundamental principles built around the idea of selfless individualism and the family and competitive liberal markets and sound money. Ideas like that have been very much at the heart of the Liberal Party. So they need to come up with ideas to address the issues of the era which relate to their fundamental belief system. So, if they're concerned about climate change, well, you've got to make your figures add up. You've got to have practical answers to address these issues, not reduce everything to just a series of empty, vacuous, meaningless slogans. And I suppose the only other message I'd have is there's no point in pretending to be like the Labor Party and thinking that the more you look like the Labor Party, the more likely you are to win an election. Actually, the reverse is true. The more the Liberal Party looks like the Labor Party, the more there is good reason to vote for the Labor Party.
Well, picking up on both those points, the key issue that demonstrates that, of course, is climate and energy policy. And in the preceding 4 elections, the coalition had taken, more practical, more economically focused policies on climate, less action to those elections, and it had served them in good stead, got them into government and kept them into government. Yet this time they decided to replicate Labor's net zero by 2050, and they were discarded. Yet so many people on the moderate wing of the Liberal Party are now saying they need to do more on climate. It seems to be the wrong lesson.
The way to win you've got to win the debates on these things. You mustn't, you just can't say, well, I'm very concerned about climate or we ought to do more. And that's, of course, a popular slogan of the Greens and the Teals and to some extent, but not to such an extent, the Labor Party. But for the Liberal Party, its message on climate should be, look, Australia must make a proportionate contribution to this global problem. We may have had bushfires and floods, but if they are caused by climate change, that's obviously debatable, but if they were caused by climate change, you're not going to be able to solve that problem here in Australia alone. It's a global problem. And so Australia, if there's an expense and a cost to our living standards and to our way of life of addressing climate change, we should make a proportionate, not a disproportionate contribution. There's no point in making a disproportionate contribution, suffering disproportionately, both in terms of living standards and way of life, for no gain, because there would be no net gain to the world if we were to do that. The second thing is that they've got to learn to argue against their opponents. I mean, I actually think it's not so difficult to explain that the Teal's target of reducing CO2 emissions by 60% by 2030, that's their target. Well, how are they going to achieve? I mean, it sounds good, and it sounds great, but how are you going to do it? Who is going to pay the bills for all of this? What are the consequences, particularly for mainstream Australia's living standards, if we're going to implement? And will implement what measures? I mean, they should be made to explain what specific measures they have in mind. And it just never happened. I never heard them trying to explain it.
They never did. They were never asked. I tried to ask Allegra Spender, and you just get platitudes. Now they're in Parliament, and people will see it. They don't have any answers, I suppose. Speaking about them getting into Parliament, I showed Monique Ryan earlier. She was saying that Australia is to blame for China's aggression towards us. So that's a worry on one level. But the other point I wanted to ask you about is you know Josh Frydenberg very well. He worked in your office back when I was in your office. You must be worried about what the Liberal Party has lost with him losing his seat. Do you think there's a way for the Liberal Party to keep him in politics? Could he be put into the Senate, for instance, in Victoria in the interim?
I don't really know the answer to that. And in any case, it depends very much on his preferences and what he would want to do. I mean, he's very, very bruised by what happened. I've never known anybody work harder as a local member and as a minister at the same time. The man was the Treasurer of Australia, did a very good job as the Treasurer in the most unbelievably difficult of times. I mean, in a sort of catastrophic time for Australia when he had to deal with the financial consequences of all the lockdowns and the like. I mean, it's beyond me, by the way. Why I can understand if the local member is a lazy member or is a poor representative of the community or whatever it is. But it's beyond me why people in Kooyong wouldn't have voted, or a majority of them wouldn't have voted for somebody like Josh. He's charming, he's decent, he's incredibly hardworking. He would be a great leader for our country. But, you know, it's up to the public. If they want to vote out really wise, sensible, hardworking people, because, you know, they think somebody else is going to come in and change the weather. Well, honestly, it's a reflection on the country and a reflection on the voters. And I don't always think the voters are right. And I think in Kooyong, they were profoundly wrong in voting out Josh Frydenberg. I think it is a huge national mistake to get rid of somebody of that quality from the national parliament. You just won't get great people standing for parliament anymore if that's the fate that's going to befall them.
Thanks for joining us, Alexander Downer. I'll talk again soon.
It's a great pleasure, Chris.
Former Liberal leader and Foreign Minister Alexander Downer there with some strong words about the decision of the people of Kooyong. You saw what they've done. They've got rid of Josh Frydenberg. Now they've got Monique Ryan, who says Australia's to blame for the tensions between Australia and China.